Ethan sat alone in his office, his gaze fixed on the glowing screen of his laptop. The numbers on the spreadsheet mocked him. Debts piling up, cash flow in the red, and his dreams of success slipping away. He ran a hand through his hair, his face lined with exhaustion. His startup, Dreamtech, had once been full of potential, but now it was a sinking ship. Every call he made seemed to push him further into a corner. How did it all go wrong? He thought as the weight of responsibility pressed on him. The investors were breathing down his neck, demanding answers, while the staff he once believed in were now questioning his decisions. He had to act fast. The reality was inescapable. If something didn't change soon, it would all be over. Ethan stood up, the cold air from the city outside rushing in through the window. His phone buzzed on the desk, but he couldn't bring himself to look at it. The pressure was suffocating. "What's next?" he whispered. Ethan stood motionless in the boardroom, the long glass table gleaming in front of him. The investors were arriving, the very people who held the fate of Dreamtech in their hands. With each passing minute, the weight of the situation grew heavier. He knew their patience had worn thin. "If I don't get this right, it's over," he thought. His company, once filled with innovation and ambition, was now on the brink of ruin. But there was no room for mistakes, no time for self-doubt. He had to convince them, to sell them on his vision one last time. As the first investor walked in, Ethan forced a smile. "Let's do this," he muttered under his breath, mentally preparing for the battle ahead. As Ethan presented his pitch to the investors, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Each word he spoke seemed to hang in the air, met with skeptical glances and sharp intakes of breath. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. One investor, a stern middle-aged woman named Margaret, raised her hand. "This is too risky, Ethan," she said, her tone cold. "We've seen startups crumble under pressure like this. What makes you think Dreamtech is any different?" Ethan took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. "Because we're different," he replied. "We've already weathered the worst. What's coming next is the turning point." But even as he spoke, he could feel the uncertainty in his own words. Ethan sat alone after the meeting, his mind racing with doubt. Did I say enough? Was I convincing? He wondered, staring at the empty conference room. The silence was suffocating. He replayed every word, every gesture, over and over in his mind. The investors had been silent, their faces unreadable. He knew the decision would come soon, and it could make or break everything. As he packed up his things, his phone buzzed again. A text from Grace, "I'm still with you. We'll figure this out." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to hold on to the sliver of hope. It wasn't over yet. The next morning, Ethan met with Grace. They sat at a small coffee shop, the hustle of the city outside contrasting with the stillness in the air between them. "I've got one shot left," Ethan said quietly, sipping his coffee. "If this doesn't work, I lose everything. Dreamtech, my reputation, my future." Grace, always calm, looked him in the eye. "It's not just about the money, Ethan. It's about who you are. The heart of this business. If you give up now, you'll regret it forever." Ethan smiled weakly. He knew she was right. But the burden of responsibility weighed heavy on him. Could he keep going, knowing what was at stake? Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the empty space where James had once sat. The betrayal was fresh, but the reality was sinking in. James had walked out without a word, taking crucial funds with him. Ethan's mind raced. How had he not seen this coming? The feeling of abandonment hit harder than he expected. He had trusted James more than anyone else, yet the man he considered a partner had left him hanging. Ethan ran his fingers through his hair, the pressure building in his chest. "I'm alone now," he thought. Every option seemed to lead to failure. The weight of the business now rested solely on his shoulders, and he had no idea how to carry it. Ethan's phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was a text from Grace. "James is gone, isn't he?" The words cut deeper than expected. He had to make a decision quickly. His investors were already breathing down his neck, demanding results. He picked up the phone and dialed Grace's number, hoping for a lifeline. The line rang twice before she picked up. "Ethan, you need to act fast. If James is gone, this company is hanging by a thread." Her words were blunt, but filled with concern. "I know," he replied, his voice strained. "But I'm running out of options." The call with Grace ended, and Ethan knew the clock was ticking. The bank had already rejected his loan request, and the investors were getting more restless. He could feel the walls closing in. The moment he hung up, his phone rang again. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. "Mr. Carter, we've been reviewing your business plan and we'd like to discuss the next steps." The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but Ethan could sense the underlying urgency. He took a deep breath and forced himself to sound composed. "I'm listening," he said. The conversation with the potential investor left Ethan feeling conflicted. On one hand, the offer seemed like the only way to save Dremtech. On the other, the terms were harsh, giving up control of the company in exchange for much-needed capital. He paced around the office, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. "This is my last chance," he muttered. He'd have to sell part of his soul to keep the business afloat, but at what cost? As he stared at the city below, Ethan felt a sense of desperation that he hadn't felt before. Was it worth it? Ethan sat at the small cafe, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. Grace had asked him to meet to discuss his options, but nothing felt clear anymore. "I never thought it would come to this," he admitted, his voice low. Grace, ever the pragmatist, was calm as always. "You don't have a choice, Ethan. If you want to survive, you'll need to make the tough decisions." She looked him in the eye. "But remember, your integrity has to matter. Don't let this business define who you are." Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't know what the future held, but the weight of Grace's words lingered. Ethan sat in his office, the phone call with the investor lingering in his mind. The terms had been agreed upon, but the deal came with a huge price. Control of Dremtech would shift. He wasn't sure if this was a victory or a surrender. The company would stay afloat, but it wouldn't be the same. Ethan had to swallow his pride, making the hardest decision of his life. His future was no longer his to determine. "But at least I can save this company," he thought, trying to find solace in the fact that he had bought time. The following morning, Ethan met with his team to break the news. The room was filled with anxious faces, each one aware that something major had changed. "I know this isn't what any of us expected," he began, his voice steady but strained. "But this is what we need to survive. We're taking on new investors, and they're taking a larger role in the company." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Ethan could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some full of doubt, others filled with fear. "We're in this together," he added, though he wasn't sure if that would be enough. Days passed, and the pressure didn't ease. Ethan worked tirelessly to get Dremtech back on track. The new investors were slowly taking control, and he felt like a spectator in his own company. But then, an unexpected visitor arrived. Grace, always the voice of reason, stood in his office doorway, looking more serious than usual. "I've found something," she said, holding up a folder. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Grace sat down, opening the folder, revealing a series of documents. "I think your old business partner James has been hiding something from you," she said, her voice calm but urgent. Ethan's pulse quickened as he scanned the papers Grace had given him. They were from James' personal accounts, showing suspicious transactions that Ethan never knew about. Why would he hide this? Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace stood beside him, her face serious. "It looks like James was siphoning funds from Dremtech. He's been setting up something on the side using the company as a cover." Ethan felt a wave of betrayal wash over him. This was worse than he had imagined. "We need to act fast," he said, his mind racing. "If we go public with this, it could ruin us. But if we don't, we might be trapped in his scheme." Ethan sat back in his chair, trying to process everything. The weight of the discovery was too much to handle alone. He dialed the number of one of the investors who had been more sympathetic to him. "We need to confront James," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. "This goes beyond business now. It's personal." The investor hesitated, but then agreed. "All right, we'll back you up. Let's get ahead of this before it blows up." As Ethan hung up the phone, a sense of determination took over. The fight for Dremtech was far from over. It was about to become even more dangerous, but Ethan was ready to take the next step. Ethan stood in the conference room, staring at the figures before him. The investors, the new management, and even Grace, everyone was there waiting for him to speak. His heart raced as he prepared for the confrontation. "We've uncovered something," he began, his voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling inside. "James has been siphoning funds and setting up a secret venture, and we need to act now." A hush fell over the room. The investors exchanged glances, their expressions filled with disbelief. "This could destroy everything we've worked for," one of them said. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "I know, but we can't let him win. We need to take control back." As the meeting continued, the tension in the room grew. "We have to move fast," Grace said, her voice cutting through the silence. "If James gets wind of this, he'll take drastic measures." Ethan's eyes met hers. "I know, but we have one shot at this." The investors were looking more and more uneasy. One of them, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, leaned forward. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" he asked. "This could backfire badly." Ethan took a deep breath. "If we don't act now, we're finished. I'd rather risk everything than let this company fall into his hands." Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a text from James. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. You don't know the full story." Ethan's hands shook as he read the message. Grace looked over his shoulder, her expression tense. "He's trying to gaslight you," she said, her voice firm. "He'll do anything to cover his tracks." Ethan stared at the screen, conflicted. "I don't have a choice," he whispered. "We have to take this to the authorities." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. The decision had been made. They couldn't let James win. With the decision made, Ethan and Grace contacted the authorities. The weight of their next steps was suffocating, but they knew it was the only option. "Once this goes public, there's no turning back," Grace warned. "James will fight back, and it will be ugly." Ethan nodded, the gravity of the situation settling in. "I'm prepared for the fallout," he replied, his voice steady. As the call ended, Ethan felt a strange sense of resolve. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about his future, and the future of everyone who had believed in him. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and press releases. James fought back hard, leaking false information to the media, trying to ruin Ethan's reputation. "They're trying to turn this into a public spectacle," Ethan said, pacing in his office. "We can't let them control the narrative." Grace was on the phone with the media, trying to calm the storm, while Ethan handled the business side. They were fighting on all fronts. But despite the chaos, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. They were fighting for what was right. "This is the beginning of the end," he said quietly. "But it's not the end of us." The days leading up to the final confrontation were filled with uncertainty. Ethan and Grace had prepared all the necessary documents, gathered all the evidence they could. They had finally gathered enough to expose James for his crimes. "This is it," Ethan said as he stood in his office, the weight of the final decision bearing down on him. "We either win this or lose everything." He looked out the window at the bustling city below, but his mind was elsewhere, on the battle that would determine the fate of Dremtech. Grace entered, her face determined. "It's time," she said. The long, exhausting fight had led them here, and now it was all on the line. Ethan and Grace walked into the meeting room where the final showdown would take place. "I know, Kyle. Call." The investors were already seated, their faces tense. James had refused to attend in person, sending his lawyer instead. "He thinks he can hide behind his attorney," Ethan muttered, his voice cold. Grace squeezed his shoulder in reassurance. "We have the truth on our side," she said. As the lawyer from James' side began to speak, Ethan could feel the pressure building. The time for words was over. "Let's end this," Ethan said, his voice steady but full of resolve. James' lawyer spoke first, attempting to deflect the blame and twist the situation. "My client was simply following business practices," he said, trying to mask the lies with polished rhetoric. But Ethan was ready. "Enough," Ethan said, his voice commanding. He slammed a stack of documents onto the table. "These are the financial records that show everything James has done. You can spin your lies all you want, but the evidence is irrefutable." The room fell silent as Ethan laid out the facts, one by one. The atmosphere shifted. This was no longer just about business. It was about justice. The lawyer's face paled as Ethan presented the final piece of evidence. "This is a breach of trust, a breach of the law," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "James was not just stealing from the company. He was setting us up for failure from the inside." Grace leaned forward, adding, "And now we'll expose him for everything he's done." The lawyer stammered, attempting to defend his client, but it was too late. The evidence was undeniable. Ethan felt the weight of the last few years finally lifting. "This is over," he said, his voice calm but resolute. With the confrontation over, the investors immediately began to take action, contacting authorities and preparing to rectify the damage James had caused. Ethan sat in his office, alone for the first time in days. He leaned back in his chair, a sense of relief washing over him. "It's finally over," he whispered to himself. Grace entered, smiling. "You did it," she said, her voice soft. Ethan nodded, looking out the window at the city below. "We did it," he corrected. The journey had been long, but Dremtech was still standing. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt hope. The office was quieter than ever, and Ethan stood in front of his window, watching the city pulse with life beneath him. The battle with James was over, but the scars remained. "It feels like everything has changed, but nothing is the same," he thought. He had saved Dremtech, but at what cost? Grace walked into the office, holding a cup of coffee. "You did it, Ethan. You saved the company," she said with a smile. Ethan turned to face her, a tired smile crossing his lips. "We did it," he replied, his voice full of gratitude. Despite the victory, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The past few months had taken a toll, but they had come out stronger. Now the real work began, rebuilding and moving forward. Ethan and Grace sat down at the conference table, the weight of the future pressing on them. The investors were in the next room, awaiting their direction. "What now?" Grace asked, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "I've been so focused on surviving that I haven't thought about the future." He looked at the financial reports spread out before them. "We need a new vision, a new plan. Dremtech has been through too much to just stay afloat. We need to grow, to adapt." Grace nodded. "We'll make it happen," she said confidently. "Together." Ethan smiled faintly. "Together," he agreed. The next few weeks were filled with long hours, late nights, and constant negotiations. Dremtech was rebuilding, but the scars of betrayal were still fresh. Ethan spent countless hours working with his team, mapping out strategies and improving operations. "It's not just about growth," he said during a meeting with his leadership team. "We have to rebuild trust with the investors, with the team, and with ourselves." His words resonated with the team. They had been through hell together, but now it was time to focus on the future. Ethan knew the hardest part was yet to come. As Dremtech slowly regained its momentum, the media began to take notice. Headlines shifted from scandal to success, and investors started to show interest once again. One morning, Ethan walked into the office to find a group of journalists waiting outside, eager to speak with him. "It's been a long road," he said during the interview. "But we're moving forward. The lessons we've learned will guide us, and we won't make the same mistakes again." Ethan looked out at the bustling city, the sun shining brightly. He had been tested in ways he never imagined, but now it was time to rebuild, and this time stronger than ever. Weeks turned into months, and Dremtech's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. The company had not only survived, but was now thriving. Ethan looked around the office, watching his team work together with a renewed sense of purpose. "We've done it," he said quietly to himself, a smile forming on his face. "It's not just about the business anymore, it's about the people we've become." Grace joined him, her smile mirroring his. "We made it through the worst, Ethan. Now, let's make sure we never forget how far we've come." Ethan nodded. "We won't, and we'll keep pushing forward, no matter what." It had been a year since the battle for Dremtech had begun. Ethan stood in front of the large glass windows of his office, gazing out at the city he had fought so hard to protect. The skyline had never looked as beautiful as it did now, but there was an emptiness inside him that the view couldn't fill. His mind raced with memories of the past, the betrayals, the sleepless nights, the constant pressure. Yet, despite everything, he had emerged victorious. But at what cost, he wondered quietly. His phone buzzed on his desk, a text from Grace. "Ready for tonight? We did it." The reminder of how far they had come brought a faint smile to his face. A year ago, Dremtech was on the brink of collapse, but today it was stronger than ever. "We made it," Ethan thought. He had always been the underdog, fighting against a system that seemed designed to crush him, but now he had a seat at the table. He picked up the phone and replied, "Yes, we did, and we're not done yet." The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like the future was his to shape. The celebratory event was in full swing, but Ethan found himself standing alone in the corner of the room. The guests mingled, laughter echoing around him, but his mind wandered back to the dark days when he thought it was all over. Grace approached him, a glass of wine in hand. "You okay?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded, offering her a half-smile. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he said, his voice soft. "It's been a hell of a year." Grace smiled, her eyes warm with pride. "It's not just about surviving, Ethan. It's about thriving. And you've done that. We've done that." Ethan met her gaze, feeling a sense of pride in their shared struggle. "We're just getting started," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. He had come to realize that success was not just about the destination, but the journey. And with Grace by his side, he felt ready for whatever came next. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself reflecting on the personal sacrifices he had made. His family had always been there, but the time he spent away from them weighed on him. The text from his sister earlier that day reminded him of the things he had missed. He stepped outside for a moment, looking up at the stars. It had been a long time since he had felt peace. "I was so consumed by the fight," he thought, "that I forgot to live." Grace joined him outside, noticing his distant look. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Ethan sighed. "Just thinking about everything I've lost and gained." Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've gained more than you realize," she said softly. "Not just in the business, but in the relationships you've rebuilt. You're not alone anymore, Ethan." Ethan looked at her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thanks, Grace," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. He knew that, no matter what, he wasn't alone anymore. The following weeks brought a new sense of clarity for Ethan. He had always been driven by the desire to prove himself, but now, he was driven by something more meaningful. Dremtech was no longer just a company. It was a legacy. The decisions he made now would shape the future, not just for him, but for his team, his family, and those who had believed in him when it seemed like everything was falling apart. He stood in his office once again, looking out at the city. But this time, there was a sense of peace in his heart. "I've done my part," he thought, "and now, it's time to let Dremtech grow beyond me." His phone buzzed with a message from Grace. "What's next, boss?" He smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "The future," he texted back. "The future is now." A few months later, Dremtech was thriving. The company had expanded into new markets, and Ethan had learned to let go of the reins, trusting his team to carry the vision forward. "You did it," Grace said to him one afternoon, as they stood in the newly opened Dremtech office, filled with new energy and excitement. Ethan smiled, his face full of gratitude. "We did it," he corrected. "This company isn't just mine. It belongs to all of us." As they looked around, Ethan felt a deep sense of pride in what they had built, not just the business, but the community. Dremtech had become a place where people didn't just work. They thrived. "This is just the beginning," Ethan said softly, a sense of peace settling in his heart.